Hey everybody, um, welcome. Glad you're here. I am going to talk a little bit today about the two stories we've been reading, The Axe and Gabriel-Ernest, and how we're moving toward writing an essay that talks about how they might use similar techniques or create similar effects in these two stories. I'm going to try to make it brief, which isn't always easy for an English teacher, but I will leave out direct quotes because I want you guys to do that work. I want you guys to go in and sort of investigate. Even if you're taking some of the ideas I'm presenting, you're going to be supporting them with your own evidence from the text. Okay, so based on our conversations that we've been having in class and the discussion boards, a couple things that have come up again and again are the idea that both of these stories create humor through irony in particular, and I'll get to kind of a lot of the ways that humor is created. And they also use they approach the horror genre from a distance, sort of, right? Whether it's the narrative approach, the narrative position, the language itself, the way that the elements of horror and violence, how those things are withheld or happen out of sight. And both stories do that to a similar effect. They try to keep the story in a somewhat real world, so to speak, right? And the characters kind of avoid the supernatural or the fantastic, right? Like fantasy elements of both stories. So let's start off with that. They both um, approach horror as a genre from a distance. The characters are separated from the the supernatural elements, the the traditionally um, horrific elements of the story. So, for example, in the Acts, we see that like the horror is delayed. We don't have any sense that this is a horror story until very end, right? Last couple paragraphs. Um, Most of this story is just a story. It's just this guy talking about his boss and the guy he had to fire. And it's very realistic. It's told with a with a realism. There's an awkwardness in his approach, his narrative approach, because has this formality with his boss, but he's clearly annoyed in many ways. However, nothing indicates that this is a horror story until we get to the very end. Nothing indicates that there is a zombie, I guess, nearly headless Shrewsbury was his name, I believe, um, outside the door. And that's such a strange detail to withhold for the narrator as well as for the author, right? So those are two separate things. The author is keeping those things separate, and that tells us a lot about the character of the narrator, right? But also the narrator is choosing not to mention specifically what the situation is or why he's writing this letter. We kind of get around to it. There's this almost politeness to it. So that way of narrating creates a distance. Similarly, the horror isn't withheld until the end of the story in Gabriel-Ernest, but it's avoided, right? Anytime there's a glimpse of something supernatural or something scary or something violent, our protagonist avoids it or ignores it, or maybe he doesn't hear it, but he seems to focus on other things that get his attention and let some of these other details slide that would be scary in other stories or would create tension or fear in other characters. So, similar way, this sort of speaking relatively properly. Um, Everything remains fairly, even keeled. These are both British writers, and they have this sense of trying to keep things very calm and even, regardless of the circumstances, and try not to freak out. But we don't see that really waver at all, which is that distance I'm talking about. Both authors are creating a distance between the horror and the character by having them act as if everything's fine. And maybe there's a bigger idea there that they're both sharing about people avoiding the problems, right, and pretending like everything's fine, regardless of the details right in front of them. The both use understatement, right? They they address these issues: a werewolf eating children, and some sort of zombie situation in the other one, and both have this understatement. There's not a long, gruesome description. Um, the violence is not shown. I mean, he sees the guy with his head coming off. Yuck. But we don't see the act of violence or know why or how or what is happening. And just like our narrators, like, I don't know, maybe it's a ghost, maybe it's real, but I figured if it's a ghost, there won't be blood seeping under the door, but I don't really want to turn around and check. Right. This is told so simply and plainly, just like the rest of his story was. And that tone and diction and style, that properness is kind of, like I said, that British, even keeled, very calm and collected. In the acts, he's speaking to his boss in the letter, so he's trying to sound very formal. And in Gabriel-Ernest, it's as if the protagonist wants to maintain propriety, right? He wants to sound proper and polite, and it's really interesting because we see that with the aunt too, right? She wants to do the right thing. She wants to be good, and she wants to be helpful, but might miss some concerning details in the process, right? And so that's a little bit about how they create a distance between horror and the characters, and that's a similarity that they share. And you might elaborate on how that really affects us as an audience, and how we experience it and take it in. But I want to talk a little bit about humor and irony. They both stories utilize irony to create humor, right? Which isn't always common in a horror genre. I think it's more common nowadays if you're watching a movie or reading a book, that genres get kind of mixed together a bit, but it wasn't always the case. Traditionally a ghost story is a ghost story, and a humorous story is humorous. Obviously there are hundreds of examples to prove me wrong, but these stories both put that kind of humor on equal footing, if not more prominent than being scary, right? I don't know if either of these stories are creepy or scary to much of an extent, right? So I don't know how many people call them horror stories, even though the content is that of a horror story. So in the acts, we have a lot of subtle characterization. Both stories do this. We see the flaws of the characters presented very subtly, and these are both realistic writers. They're writing with realism. They're writing a relatively contemporary world, relatively normal people, and the flaws of these people are being revealed through their thoughts and actions and responses, right? In the acts, this guy clearly wants to be polite and proper and show respect to his boss, but there's clearly a bitterness there because he doesn't seem to get enough attention for his work or all that he does as the manager, branch manager, building manager, whatever it's called in the story. So there's a bitterness there. He's mad that Shrewsbury's getting fired and the boss doesn't appreciate it. He almost has this love for Shrewsbury, and he's mad the boss can't appreciate him. And it's very subtle, the way these things are presented in his language. Same with Gabriel-Ernest. There's a subtlety in the characterization, like with the aunt who just wants to do the right thing, wants to be charitable. She's religious. She wants Gabriel-Ernest to help with the Sunday school, the infant Sunday school, the author specifies. Right, she wants so well to just be kind and do the right thing, but ends up doing way worse, right? And so we could argue how much of it's her fault or the protagonist's fault, um, for not really, listening to the concerning signals they were getting. But that, like I said, that there's that subtle characterization that shows the flaws in the character, and the main character in Gabriel-Ernest clearly wants to kind of be polite and proper, and not lose his temper, and he wants to avoid conflict with this strange naked boy in his house. It's a weird story. Okay. Um, Another element of that, the irony, is I think some of the humor in it is how the violence is off stage, so to speak, or off of the page, kind of like what I talked about with that distance. But I think that can also create humor because when by the time the horror arrives in the acts, it's presented so matter of factly and like it's a mundane detail about work life, right? That he comes in, his head is nearly severed, um, and the narrator, the guy writing this letter to his boss, is like, and then I went into my office and shut the door. Um, right. So that understatement, I know I mentioned understatement when talking about keeping a distance between the characters and the horror, but that understatement is really used for comedic effect too, right? It's so simply told by the narrator in the acts. And same with Gabriel-Ernest, it's so matter of factly presented, um, that this main character is sort of like, hmm, that seems concerning, but doesn't necessarily do anything about it, right? Huge key component of both stories is that understatement in the tone and how that is used to create humor, right? Because that's ironic. There's no reaction of horror and fear, really, right? We can sense fear in small ways, but they're not going to show it. They're going to do whatever they can not to show any emotion, these characters. Very English. And um, their tone, but also the overall tone that the authors are using in both stories. That disconnection that we talked about is in and of itself, an irony that's used for humor there. So both stories keep the main characters at a distance from those horror elements. Um, that creates an interesting effect, how they're both presented as very real world, normal, true to life, realistic stories. They're stories by authors of realism, and yet they're horror stories, if you really get down to it. And then they both use irony to create humor, which is unique in a lot of different ways. So I'm not going to give you all the examples, but I wanted to go over those two main ideas because I think that's going to be useful as we move forward into an essay. So your job is going to be to try to formulate those two claims that will ultimately be body paragraphs of an essay, and start finding evidence. Two claims, and then some concrete details, some direct evidence, at least. Let's do three. Deal with it. Three quotes, three pieces of evidence to support each of your two claims. It's going to be up to you how to write them, how to word them. But I gave you a lot to think about, I hope. All right, guys. Do some good work. Find some good quotes. I'm going to stop this recording.